Miss Marple, the hidden detail that cracked the case wide open. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of St. Mary Modesty. Mary Mead was as peaceful as a sunny afternoon. The little village, with its neat cottages and winding lanes, felt like a place where nothing ever happened. But Miss Jane Marple knew better. She sat in her garden, her hands busy with roses, her eyes sharp as ever. At her age, with her white hair tucked under a straw hat, she looked like any old lady, but her mind was quick, always picking up tiny details others missed. The village had been buzzing lately. A new family, the Ashfords, had moved into Willow House, the big stone mansion at the edge of town. It had stood empty for years, its windows dark, its garden wild. Now, with the Ashfords there, St. Mary Mead had something new to talk about. Clara Ashford, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and a tight smile, was the lady of the house. Her second husband, George, was a quiet man who liked his pipe and his books. Clara's stepson, Robert, was in his 20s, handsome but moody. Then there was Emily, Clara's young niece, who had big eyes and a nervous way of talking. The village loved to whisper about them. "They're rich, no doubt," Mrs. Price at the post office had said, her voice low. "But why come here? And what about Clara's first husband? Died sudden, they say, very sudden." Miss Marple didn't gossip, but she listened. She always listened. People said things without meaning to, and those bits and pieces were like threads in a knitting pattern. Pull one, and the whole thing could unravel. That morning, as Miss Marple clipped a thorny stem, she saw Clara Ashford walk past her gate. Clara's coat was too fancy for St. Mary Mead's dusty lanes, and her face looked tight, like she was hiding something. Miss Marple smiled politely. "Good day, Mrs. Ashford," she called. Clara stopped, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, good day." Her voice was sharp, like a knife cutting through cloth. She hurried on, not looking back. Miss Marple watched her go. Something about Clara's quick steps made her think of Mrs. Hodges, a woman from years ago who'd run off after stealing from the church fund. People who moved fast often had something to hide. By noon, the village was getting ready for a tea party at the vicarage. Miss Marple put away her gardening tools and changed into her best dress, a soft blue one that matched her eyes. She walked to the vicarage, her stick tapping the ground. The tea party was a big event. Everyone was there: Mrs. Price, the vicar, Dolly Bantry from the manor, and, of course, the Ashfords. The vicarage garden was full of chatter and the clink of teacups. Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair, sipping tea and watching. Clara Ashford stood near the rose bushes, talking to Robert. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple's ears were sharp. "You can't keep asking about it, Robert," Clara said, her words clipped. "The brooch is gone. Let it be." Robert's face was red. "It was father's. You had no right to lose it." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. A brooch. She remembered Mrs. Price mentioning a sapphire brooch, a family treasure from Clara's first husband. It was worth a lot, they said, and had vanished years ago. Robert's voice was loud enough to make heads turn, but Clara pulled him aside, her smile forced. Emily, the niece, sat alone, picking at a scone. Miss Marple moved closer. "You look worried, dear," she said kindly. Emily jumped. "Oh, it's nothing, Miss Marple. Just family things." Her eyes darted to Clara and Robert. Miss Marple nodded, her face soft but her mind racing. Family things often meant trouble. She thought of young Tommy Brown, a boy from the village who'd fought with his uncle over money and ended up in jail. Families could be messy. The tea party went on, with laughter and gossip filling the air. But Miss Marple kept watching the Ashfords. George Ashford stood by the vicar, puffing his pipe, looking bored. Clara kept smoothing her dress, her fingers. Nervous, Robert stormed off toward Willow House, his fists tight. Emily followed him with her eyes, her face pale. By evening, Miss Marple was back home, knitting by her fire. The village felt quiet, too quiet. She was halfway through a row when someone knocked hard on her door. It was Dolly Bantry, her face white as chalk. "Jane," Dolly gasped. "You must come to Willow House. Something awful's happened." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "What is it, Dolly?" "It's Robert Ashford. He's dead." Miss Marple's heart didn't skip, but her mind sharpened. She grabbed her coat and followed Dolly through the dark lanes to Willow House. The big mansion loomed under the moon, its windows glowing like eyes. Inside, the air was thick with shock. Clara sat in the parlour, her hands shaking. George stood by the window, his pipe forgotten. Emily was crying in a corner, a handkerchief pressed to her face. Inspector Craddock was already there, his notebook out. He was a young man, but he knew Miss Marple's knack for solving puzzles. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "Glad you're here. It's a bad business." He led her to the library, a room with tall shelves and a big oak desk. Robert Ashford lay on the floor, his shirt stained red. A single stab wound marked his chest. There was no knife, no blood trail, just Robert, still and cold. Miss Marple looked around. The library was neat, too neat. A rug was slightly crooked, as if someone had tripped. A window was open, letting in a chilly breeze. And there, by the desk, was a knitting needle, its silver tip glinting in the lamplight. Miss Marple bent down, her eyes narrow. It wasn't hers, but it looked like one. Clara had shown off at a village fair, proud of her needlework. "Who found him?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Emily," said Inspector Craddock. "She came to talk to him after the tea party. Found him like this and screamed." Miss Marple glanced at Emily, who was still crying. Clara's face was blank, but her eyes were hard. George muttered something about checking the grounds, but he stayed put. "Any sign of the weapon?" Miss Marple asked. Craddock shook his head. "Not yet. The wound's clean, though. Something sharp, like a thin blade." Miss Marple didn't say anything about the knitting needle. It was odd, lying there, far from any sewing basket, she thought. Of Clara's sharp words at the tea party, Robert's anger about the brooch. People killed for less than a sapphire, she knew. She remembered old Mr. Grayson, who'd fought his brother over a gold watch and ended up with a broken skull. The constable, a nervous young man named Tom, was taking notes. "Mrs. Ashford says she was in her room," he said. Mr. Ashford was in the study. Miss Emily was out walking. Miss Marple nodded, her face calm. Alibis were like knitting patterns. Sometimes they had holes. She looked at the knitting. Needle again. Why was it here? Clara didn't seem the type to leave her things lying about. Dolly Bantry whispered, "Jane, what do you think?" "It's dreadful, isn't it?" "It's curious," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Very curious." The village clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the night. Inspector Craddock was giving orders, telling Tom to search the garden. Clara stood, saying she needed air. George followed her, his face grim. Emily stayed, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple walked to the open window, her stick tapping softly. The night was dark, but she heard something, a faint whistle, like a bird but not quite. It stopped as soon as it started. She thought of old Mrs. Carter, who'd heard a whistle before her shop was robbed years ago. Whistles meant signals. Sometimes, Miss Marple, Craddock called, anything catch your eye? She smiled faintly. Oh, just an old lady's fancies. But that knitting needle, it's not where it should be, is it? Craddock frowned, looking at the needle. Mrs. Ashford says it's hers, but she doesn't know how it got here. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. A knitting needle, a missing brooch, a whistle in the night. Threads, all of them, waiting to be pulled. She thought of Robert's red face at the tea party, his words about the brooch. Had he known something dangerous? Had someone wanted him quiet? As the constable searched the garden, Miss Marple stayed in the library, her eyes moving from the rug to the desk to the needle. Dolly Bantry hovered nearby, her voice a whisper. Jane, you've got that look. You see something, don't you? Miss Marple's smile was small. I see what's there, Dolly. The trick is seeing what isn't. The room grew quiet, except for the tick of a clock. Outside, the constable's lantern bobbed in the dark. Miss Marple's fingers itched for her knitting, but her mind was already at work, piecing together the puzzle. Robert Ashford was dead, and someone in Willow House knew why. The knitting needle, out of place, was a thread she'd pull later. For now, she'd watch and listen, as she always did. The night stretched on, and St. Mary Mead was no longer so peaceful. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the library at Willow House, smelled of old books and wax polish, but the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. Miss Jane Marple stood near the open window, her blue eyes scanning every corner. Robert Ashford's body still lay on the floor, his face pale under the lamplight. The red stain on his shirt was stark, a single stab wound telling a grim story. Inspector Craddock was busy, his notebook full of scribbles, while the young constable, Tom, hovered near the door, looking green dot. Miss Marple's mind was sharp, picking up details like threads in a tangled skein. The rug was crooked, as if someone had slipped. The window was open, letting in a chilly breeze that fluttered the curtains. And there, by the oak desk, was the knitting needle, its silver tip catching the light. It didn't belong here, she thought. Clara Ashford had claimed it was hers, but why was it in the library, far from any sewing basket? Inspector Craddock knelt by Robert's body, his face serious. No sign of the weapon yet, he said, glancing at Miss Marple. The wound's clean, made by something thin and sharp. A knife, maybe, or a dagger. Miss Marple nodded, her lips tight. She didn't mention the knitting needle, not yet. It was too early to pull that thread. She thought of old Mr. Jenkins, a village butcher who'd been stabbed with a skewer years ago. The weapon had been small, easy to hide. Could a knitting needle do the same? Dolly Bantry stood nearby, twisting her handkerchief. Jane, it's awful, she whispered. Who would do this to Robert? He was so young. People do terrible things, Dolly, Miss Marple said softly. Sometimes for reasons we can't guess at first. Craddock stood, brushing his knees. Let's hear from the family again. Mrs. Ashford, can you come in? Clara Ashford stepped into the library, her face pale but her eyes hard, like polished stones. She wore a dark dress, her hands clasped tight. I've told you, Inspector, she said, her voice sharp. I was in my room after the tea party. I didn't see Robert after he left the vicarage, and you, Mr. Ashford. Craddock turned to George, who was lurking by the bookshelf, his pipe cold in his hand. George cleared his throat. I was in the study, reading. Didn't hear a thing until Emily screamed. Miss Marple watched George. His hands shook slightly, and his eyes darted to Clara. She thought of Mr. Potter, a man from St. Mary Mead who'd lied about his whereabouts during a theft. Shaky hands often meant a shaky story, and Miss Emily Craddock asked Amelie stood in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. I was walking in the garden, she said, her voice small. I came back to talk to Robert about something. That's when I found him. Miss Marple tilted her head. Emily's something sounded like a secret. She remembered young Sally Green, who'd stammered the same way when hiding her brother's mischief. What did you want to talk about, dear? Miss Marple asked. Her voice kind. Emily flushed. It was nothing, just family matters. Clara shot Emily a look, quick and sharp. Miss Marple caught it, storing it away like a stitch in her knitting. Families, she knew, were full of secrets, and secrets could turn deadly. Craddock turned to Clara, Mrs. Ashford, about that knitting needle. He pointed to the silver needle on the floor. You said it's yours. Clara's face tightened. Yes, it's mine. I use it for my needlework, but I never brought it to the library. I keep my things upstairs. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara's voice was too quick, like someone covering a mistake. She thought of Mrs. Lane, a village woman who'd sworn she'd lost her brooch, only for it to turn up in her own drawer. People lied about small things to hide bigger ones. Craddock scribbled in his notebook. Constable, check the house for anything sharper, knife, a letter opener, anything that could have made this wound. Tom nodded and hurried off, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Miss Marple moved to the desk, pretending to adjust her glasses. The knitting needle was still. There, its tip gleaming. She bent closer, her fingers itching to touch it, but she didn't. Evidence, she knew, must stay untouched. Instead, she looked at the rug again. Its corner was curled, as if someone had kicked it in a hurry. And the window, why was it open? On such a cold night. Dolly, Miss Marple said quietly, did you hear anything odd tonight, before you came to fetch me? Dolly frowned, thinking. Not really, Jane, though. Old Mr. Harris, the neighbour, mentioned a whistle, said he. Heard it just before Emily screamed. Thought it was a bird, but it didn't sound right. Miss Marple's heart gave a little jump, though her face stayed calm. A whistle. She remembered the robbery at Mrs. Carter's shop years ago. A whistle had been the signal for the thief to slip away. Could it mean something here? She filed it away, another thread to pull later. Craddock was questioning Emily now. You're sure you didn't see anyone else in the house? No strangers. Emily shook her head. No one, just us. But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. The open window bothered her. Someone could have slipped in or out. She thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd climbed through a window to steal apples and nearly got away with it. Windows were easy for someone sneaky. The constable came back, his face red. Nothing yet, sir, he said to Craddock. No knives, no blood, nothing outside either. Craddock sighed. Keep looking, and ask the neighbours if they saw anything. Miss Marple stepped closer to Robert's body, her stick tapping softly. She looked at his hands, curled tight, as if he'd been holding something. She leaned down, careful not to touch, and saw a tiny corner of paper sticking out of his pocket. Inspector, she said, her voice gentle, you might want to check his pocket. Craddock knelt and pulled out a torn scrap of paper. He held it to the light, squinting. It says, Blue Spark. Just those two words, mean anything to you, Mrs. Ashford?" Clara's face went white, but she shook her head. "No, it's nonsense." George coughed, looking away. Emily's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind racing. Blue spark, the sapphire brooch, she thought. Robert had been angry about it at the tea party. Was this his note, or someone else's? "Dolly," Miss Marple whispered, "that brooch Clara mentioned at the tea party. Sapphire, wasn't it?" Dolly nodded. "Yes, a big one. Worth a fortune, they say. Belonged to her first husband." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Fortune could make people do terrible things. She thought of Mr. Grayson and his gold watch, how it had torn his family apart. A sapphire brooch could do the same. Craddock slipped the paper into a small bag. "I'll have this checked," he said. "Miss Marple, any thoughts?" She smiled, her eyes soft but sharp. "Oh, I'm just an old lady, Inspector. But that note, it's curious, isn't it? And the window. Someone might have come through." Craddock glanced at the window, frowning. "You think someone from outside did this?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that we should keep our minds open." The library grew quiet, except for the clock ticking on the mantel. Clara sat down, her hands twisting in her lap. George lit his pipe, but his hands still shook. Emily stared at the floor, her face pale. Miss Marple watched them, her mind like a needle threading through clues. The knitting needle, the open window, the whistle, the note with blue spark. They were pieces of a puzzle, and she was good at puzzles. Outside, the constable's lantern moved through the garden, a small light in the dark. Miss Marple thought of the whistle again. Signals meant plans, and plans meant someone had thought. This through, she remembered Clara's sharp words at the tea party, Robert's anger, Emily's nervous eyes, and George. Why was he so quiet? "Dolly," Miss Marple said, "I think I'll stay a bit longer. There's more to see here." Dolly nodded, her eyes wide. "You always see things, Jane, things nobody else does." Miss Marple didn't answer. She looked at the knitting needle again, its silver tip gleaming like a warning. It didn't belong here, and neither did Robert's death. Someone in Willow House knew why he was dead, and she meant to find out who. As Craddock gave more orders, Miss Marple stepped to the window, listening to the night. The whistle was gone, but its echo stayed. In her mind, blue spark, she thought. A sapphire, a secret, a murder. The threads were there, waiting for her to pull them. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 3. Whispers of the past. The morning sun spilled over St. Mary Mead, painting the cottages gold, but Miss Jane Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Robert Ashford's death hung over the village like a dark cloud. She sat in her parlour, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving through the clues from Willow House. The knitting needle, the open window, the strange whistle, and that scrap of paper with blue spark written on it. Each was a thread in a tangled pattern, and Miss Marple was good at untangling. She thought of the Ashfords' Clara with her tight smile, George with his shaky hands, Emily with her nervous eyes. They all had stories, but were they true? Miss Marple knew people lied, sometimes for small reasons, sometimes for murder. She remembered Mrs. Hodges, who'd lied about a stolen ring to cover her gambling debts. The Ashfords' secrets felt bigger. To learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit her nephew, Raymond West, in London. Raymond was a writer, always poking into interesting corners of the world. If anyone could dig up dirt on the Ashfords, it was him. She packed a small bag, put on her best hat, and caught the morning train. The countryside rolled by, green and quiet, but her thoughts stayed on Willow House. In London, Raymond's flat was a mess of books and papers. He greeted her with a grin. "Aunt Jane, what brings you to the big city?" "Another mystery." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. "Just a little puzzle, dear. Tell me, have you heard of the Ashfords? They've moved to St. Mary Mead, into Willow House." Raymond's grin faded. "Ashfords, I know that name. Hold on." He rummaged through a pile of papers, pulling out a clipping from an old newspaper. "Airy Clara Ashford S.'s first husband, Henry Langston. He was a jeweller, quite rich. Died about 10 years ago. Fell down the stairs, they said, but some thought it wasn't an accident." Miss Marple leaned forward, her glasses glinting. "Not an accident? What did people say?" Raymond scanned the clipping. "Rumors, mostly. Henry was working on a big sailor sapphire brooch worth a fortune. It went missing after his death. Some said Clara sold it to pay debts. Others said she, well, helped him fall." Miss Marple's lips tightened. She thought of Robert at the tea party, angry about that same brooch. Had he known something about his father's death? "Anything else, Raymond?" He nodded. "There was a man, Victor Lane, Henry's apprentice. He had a limp from an old accident. People thought he stole the brooch, but he vanished before the police could prove it." A limp. Miss Marple's mind snapped to the whistle from last night. Signals and secrets. She thanked Raymond and caught the evening train back to St. Mary Mead, her thoughts spinning. Clara's past was murky, and Robert's death felt tied to it. Back in the village, the air was thick with gossip. Mrs. Price at the post office was telling everyone about Robert's murder, stabbed right in the heart. She said, her eyes wide, "And that Clara Ashford, so high and mighty, I bet she knows more than she's saying." Miss Marple didn't join the chatter, but she listened. She walked to Willow House, her stick tapping the path. Emily was in the garden, pulling weeds, her face pale. Miss Marple paused at the gate. "Good afternoon, dear," she said, her voice kind. "Hard work, gardening, clears the mind, doesn't it?" Emily looked up, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, I suppose so." Her hands shook as she tugged a weed. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You seem troubled, Emily. Is it about Robert?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "He was my cousin, sort of. He was looking into things, about Aunt Clara's first husband. He thought she wasn't telling the truth about how he died." Miss Marple nodded, her face soft, but her mind sharp. "What did Robert find?" Emily glanced at the house, as if afraid someone might hear. "He said the sapphire brooch wasn't lost. He thought Aunt Clara hid it. He was asking questions, hiring people to dig into it. He even wrote to someone in London." Miss Marple's heart gave a little jump. A private investigator, perhaps. She thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd hired a detective to find his stolen bike, only to stir up trouble. Did Robert mention anyone else? Someone he met? Emily shook her head. No, but he was angry. He said the brooch was his father's, and Aunt Clara had no right to it. Miss Marple patted Emily's hand. "You've been very brave, dear. Don't worry. Things have a way of coming clear." As she walked away, Miss Marple's mind turned to the brooch. A sapphire, a fortune, a death. She thought of the blue spark note in Robert's pocket. Was it about the brooch? And who wrote it? That evening, she stopped by the village shop to buy tea. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harris, was sweeping the floor, his face grim. "Terrible business at Willow House," he said. "I saw something odd that night, Miss Marple. A man near the house, just before the scream. He was in the shadows, moving quick." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A man, did you see his face?" Mr. Harris shook his head. "Too dark. But he had a funny walk, like his leg wasn't right. Limped, you know." "A limp, Victor Lane." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. That's very helpful." She walked home, her stick tapping, her mind racing. A man with a limp, a whistle, a brooch. The threads were starting to connect, but the pattern wasn't clear yet. She thought of Mrs. Carter's robbery again, how a stranger with a limp had been seen before the theft. Strangers in St. Mary Mead were rare, and this one felt important. At home, Miss Marple lit her fire and sat with her knitting, though her hands stayed still. She thought of Clara's tight smile, George's shaky hands, Emily's tears, and now, a shadowy man with a limp. Robert had been digging into his father's death, and someone didn't like it. Had that someone killed him? The next morning, the village was buzzing again. Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Price at the post office. The groundskeeper from Willow House, old Mr. Tate, had vanished. He'd left a note in his cottage, scrawled in a hurry, "Gone away, not safe." Mrs. Price was full of theories. He saw something, mark my words. Maybe the killer. Miss Marple didn't gossip, but she listened. Mr. Tate had been at Willow House for years, tending the gardens. If he'd seen something, it could be a key to the puzzle. She thought of Mr. Grayson's case, how a gardener had seen a fight and run off, scared. People ran when they knew too much. She decided to visit Dolly Bantry, her friend at the manor. Dolly was sipping tea in her parlour, her face worried. "Jane, have you heard? Mr. Tate's gone. The whole village is talking." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair. "What do they say, Dolly?" "Oh, all sorts. Some think he killed Robert and ran. Others say he saw the killer and got scared." "What do you think?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think Mr. Tate knows something." "Did he ever mention anything odd about Willow House?" Dolly thought hard. "Not much, but he did say he saw a man in the garden a few nights ago. Said he was limping, like he'd hurt his leg." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her stick. Another limp. The pattern was growing clearer. "Did he say anything else?" Dolly shook her head. "No, but he looked frightened. Said he didn't like working at Willow House anymore." Miss Marple thanked Dolly and walked home, her mind busy. A man with a limp, a missing groundskeeper, a sapphire brooch. She thought of the knitting needle in the library, the blue spark note. Robert had been close to something dangerous, and it had cost him his life. As she reached her cottage, the village clock struck noon, its chimes soft in the air. Miss Marple paused, looking toward Willow House. Mr. Tate was gone, but he wasn't far, she thought. People didn't vanish without a trace, and that man with the limpy was a thread she needed to pull. She went inside, her mind set. She'd talk to Inspector Craddock tomorrow, see if he'd found Mr. Tate, and she'd watch the Ashfords, especially Clara, the brooch, the death, the secrets they all pointed to Willow House. Miss Marple knew the truth was there, hiding like a needle in a haystack. She just had to find it. Chapter 4. The shadowy figure, the village of St. Mary Mead, buzzed with whispers, like bees around a hive. Mr. Tate, the groundskeeper at Willow House, had vanished, and his note gone away. Not safe had set tongues wagging. Miss Jane. Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving through the puzzle of Robert Ashford's murder. The knitting needle, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, and now a man with a limp seen near Willow House. They were all threads, and she was determined to pull them together. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thinking of the ash. Clara's sharp eyes, George's shaky hands, Emily's nervous tears, they all hid something, and Mr. Tate's disappearance felt like a big clue. She remembered old Mr. Grayson's case, how a gardener had run off after seeing a fight. People didn't vanish unless they were scared or guilty. She decided to visit Dolly Bantry at the manor. Dolly always knew the village gossip, and gossip, Miss Marple knew, was like loose stitches in a sweater pull one, and the truth might show. She put on her coat, grabbed her stick, and walked through the crisp morning air. The village was quiet, but eyes peeked from behind curtains. St. Mary Mead loved a mystery. At the manor, Dolly was in her parlour, arranging flowers. "Jane," she said, her eyes wide, "have you heard? Mr. Tate's gone, and the village is in a tizzy. Some say he killed Robert and ran. Others think he saw the killer." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her face calm. "What do you think, Dolly? Did Mr. Tate ever say anything odd?" Dolly frowned, her hands busy with roses. "He was jumpy lately. At the village fete last week, he told me he saw a stranger near Willow House, a man with a limp, asking about the ash." Tate thought he was trouble. Miss Marple's heart gave a little jump, but her voice stayed soft. "A limp, you say? Did he describe him?" "Tall, thin, with a dark coat," Dolly said. "Tate said the man kept to the shadows, like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A man with a limp, just like Victor Lane, the jeweller's apprentice from Clara's past. She thought of the whistle Mr. Harris had heard the night of the murder. Signals and secrets, she thought, like the robbery at Mrs. Carter's shop years ago, where a limping stranger had been part of the plan. "Thank you, Dolly," Miss Marple said, standing. "I think I'll have a word with Inspector Craddock." She walked to the village police station, her stick tapping the path. The station was small, with a single desk where Constable Tom sat, looking tired. Inspector Craddock was there, his notebook open, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "You're out early. Got a theory?" She smiled, her eyes sharp. "Just a few thoughts, Inspector. Have you found Mr. Tate?" Craddock sighed. "We did, actually. He's hiding in a boarding house in Dannymoth, 10 miles away. Tom brought him back this morning. He's scared, says he saw something the night." "Robert died?" Miss Marple leaned on her stick. "May I speak with him?" Craddock raised an eyebrow but nodded. "He's in the back. Don't spook him, though. He's jumpy." Mr. Tate sat in a small room, his hands twisted together. He was an old man, with a weathered face and eyes that darted like a frightened rabbit's. Miss Marple sat across from him, her voice gentle. "Mr. Tate, you've had quite a fright. Can you tell me what you saw?" Tate licked his lips, glancing at the door. "I didn't do nothing, Miss Marple, I swear, but I saw a man. That night in the garden, tall, with a limp. He was talking to Mr. George, near the hedge. Looked like an argument." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. "Mr. Georgie, Ashford." "What were they saying?" "Didn't hear much," Tate said. "Something about money and a promise. The man with the limp was angry, waving his arms. Then I heard that whistle, just before Miss Emily screamed. Miss Marple nodded, her mind clicking like knitting needles. George and a limping man, arguing. The whistle, a signal. She thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd overheard a fight and got scared. "Why did you run, Mr. Tate?" Tate's eyes widened. "I thought he'd come for me next. That man, he looked dangerous. And after Robert was killed, I didn't feel safe." "Thank you, Mr. Tate," Miss Marple said, patting his hand. "You've been very brave." She stepped outside, where Craddock was waiting. "Well?" he asked. "Curious," she said, her eyes twinkling. Mr. Tate saw George Ashford. "With a man who limps." Just before the murder, Craddock's jaw tightened. George didn't mention any visitor, said he was in the study all night. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "People forget things, Inspector, or choose not to remember." She walked back to Willow House, her mind busy. George's alibi had a hole, and the man with the limp was a big clue. She thought of the blue spark note, the sapphire brooch, Clara's past. Was George hiding something, or was he protecting someone? At Willow House, the air was tense. Clara was in the parlour, sorting papers, her face tight. George was outside, smoking his pipe, his eyes on the ground. Emily was in the garden, pulling weeds again, her hands shaking. Miss Marple knocked and was let in by the maid, who looked nervous. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said, stepping into the parlour, "I hope I'm not intruding. I was wondering about Robert. He seemed so upset at the tea party about the brooch." Clara's hands froze on the papers. "That old thing, it's long gone. Robert was foolish to fuss over it." Miss Marple nodded, watching Clara's eyes. They were too quick, too guarded. She thought of Mrs. Lane, who'd lied about a lost brooch to cover a theft. "It must be hard, losing something so valuable," she said softly. Clara shrugged, but her fingers twitched. "It's just a jewel. Not worth all this trouble." Miss Marple smiled, her mind sharp. Clara was hiding something, just like George. She thought of the knitting needle in the library, the whistle, the limping man. The threads were tying together. But the knot wasn't clear yet. Outside, she found George by the garden shed, his pipe smoke curling in the air. "Good day, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice kind. "It's a lovely garden. Mr. Tate did fine work." George started his pipe, nearly falling. "Tate, oh yes, he's gone now." "So I heard," Miss Marple said, her eyes on his face. "Did you see anyone in the garden the night Robert died?" "A visitor, perhaps." George's face went red. "No one. I was in the study, like I told the inspector." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was racing. George's red face was like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied about a theft. She thought of Mr. Tate's story, the limping man, the argument. George knew more than he was saying. As she walked back to her cottage, the village was quiet, but the air felt heavy, like before a storm. Miss Marple thought of the clues, the knitting needle, the blue spark note, the whistle, the man with the limp. And now, George's lie. She remembered a case years ago where a man had lied about a visitor to protect a secret. Was George protecting himself for Clara? At home, she lit her fire and sat with her knitting, though her hands stayed still. The puzzle was growing clearer, but one piece was missing. The man with the limp was he Victor Lane, and what did he want with George? She thought of the sapphire brooch, Robert's anger, Clara's past. The truth was close. She could feel it. The village clock struck 6. its chimes soft in the evening air. Miss Marple set her knitting down and walked to her desk. She wrote a note to Inspector Craddock, asking him to check George's story. Then she paused, her pen hovering. Something Mr. Tate had said stuck in her mind, money and a promise. Was it about the brooch, or something darker? As she sealed the note, there was a knock at her door. It was Constable Tom, his face pale. "Miss Marple, we found something at Willow House. In the library desk, a hidden drawer. There's a photograph. Inside Mrs. Ashford with a man. He's got a limp." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Bring it to me, Tom, and tell the inspector I'll be at Willow House tomorrow." Tom nodded and hurried off. Miss Marple sat back, her mind like a needle threading clues. A photograph, a limping man, a hidden drawer. The pattern was almost complete, but one thread was still loose. She'd find it, she thought, at Willow House. Chapter 5. The man with the limp. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a quiet hush. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle, her mind stitching together the clues of Robert Ashford's murder. The knitting needle in the library, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, the man with the limp, and now a photograph hidden in a secret drawer. These were threads in a tangled web, and she was close to unraveling it. The photograph, showing Clara Ashford with a limping man, felt like a key. But who was he, and why was he at Willow House? Miss Marple thought of the Ashfords, Clara's guarded eyes, George's shaky hands, Emily's nervous tears. They all had secrets, and secrets, she knew, could lead to murder. She remembered Mrs. Lane, who'd hidden a stolen brooch and lied to everyone. Clara's past, with her first husband's death and the missing sapphire brooch, was starting to look like the heart of this puzzle. She decided to call Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend from Scotland Yard. He knew people and their stories, and if anyone could name the man in the photograph, it was him. She wrote a quick letter describing the limping man and the Ashfords' history, and sent it by post. Then she put on her coat and hat, grabbed her stick, and headed to Willow House. The village was buzzing with talk about Mr. Tate's return and his tale of a limping stranger. But Miss Marple kept her thoughts to herself. At Willow House, the air was thick with tension. Clara was in the parlour, sorting letters, her face pale. George was in the garden, puffing his pipe, his eyes darting. Emily was by the rose bushes, her hands busy but her face worried. Miss Marple knocked, and the maid let her in, looking as nervous as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but her eyes sharp. "I hope you're managing with all this trouble." Clara looked up, her smile tight. "We're coping, Miss Marple. It's a difficult time." Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair. "I heard about the photograph found in the library desk. A man with a limp, I believe." Clara's hands froze on the letters. "A photograph. I don't know anything about it." Miss Marple watched her closely. Clara's voice was too quick, like Mrs. Hodges when she'd lied about stealing. "From the church fund?" "It's curious," Miss Marple said softly. "The man seems familiar, doesn't he? From your past, perhaps?" Clara's eyes flashed. "I've no idea what you mean. My past has nothing to do with this." Miss Marple smiled, her mind racing. Clara was hiding something, just like George. She thought of the blue spark note, the sapphire brooch, the whistle. The limping man was a thread that tied them together, and she needed his name. She left the parlor and found Emily in the garden. The girl was pulling weeds, her hands shaking. "Emily, dear," Miss Marple said, "you look troubled. Is it about Robert?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "It's everything, Miss Marple. Robert was so angry about Aunt Clara's brooch. He said it wasn't lost, that she'd hidden it. And then I saw her, a week ago, talking to a man in the garden." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. "A man? What did he look like?" "Tall, thin, with a dark coat," Emily said, her voice low. "He had a limp." Aunt Clara looked upset, like they were arguing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind clicking like knitting needles. A limping man, arguing with Clara. She thought of Mr. Tate's story, George, with a limping man, and now Clara. Were they meeting the same person? "Did you hear what they said, dear?" Emily shook her head. "Not much. Something about a promise and money," the man said. "You owe me." Then Aunt Clara sent him away. Miss Marple patted Emily's hand. "You've been very helpful, dear. Don't worry." As she walked away, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the photograph. Clara and a limping man, hidden in a secret drawer. She thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd hidden a stolen apple in a drawer, thinking no one would find it. Secrets always came out. Back at her cottage, a letter from Sir Henry was waiting. She opened it, her fingers steady but her heart quick. Sir Henry's neat handwriting filled the page. "Dear Jane, your limping man sounds like Victor Lane, a jeweller's apprentice who worked for Clara's first husband, Henry Langston. Victor had a limp from a cart accident years ago. He was suspected of stealing the sapphire brooch after Henry's death, but he vanished before the police could catch him. A shady character, Jane. Be careful." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Victor Lane, the name fit like a missing stitch. She thought of the whistle, the blue spark note, the brooch. Victor was tied to Clara's past, and now he was here, in St. Mary Mead. But why? She decided to visit Inspector Craddock at the police station. The village was quiet, but eyes watched from behind curtains. At the station, Craddock was sorting papers, his face tired. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're a regular visitor now. Got something for me?" She smiled, her eyes sharp. "I've a name, Inspector. Victor Lane. He worked for Clara's first husband and had a limp. He was seen near Willow House by Mr. Tate and Emily." Craddock's eyebrows shot up. "Victor Lane. We got a tip this morning. He was spotted in Danamoth at a pub. I'm sending Tom to check." Miss Marple nodded, her mind busy. "What about the photograph? Did it show anything else?" Craddock pulled out a small envelope and slid the photograph across the desk. It was old, the edges worn. Clara, younger, stood next to a tall, thin man with a cane. His face was sharp, his eyes cold. Miss Marple studied it, her heart beating. "Faster, Victor Lane, no doubt." "There's writing on the back," Craddock said, flipping it over. In faded ink, it read, "Clara and Victor, London, 1915. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Clara had lied, saying she didn't know the man. She thought of Mrs. Lane, who'd lied about a brooch to hide a theft. Clara's lies were bigger, and they pointed to murder. "Inspector," she said, "you might ask Clara about Victor Lane, and check if George met him too. Mr. Tate saw them together." Craddock nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "I'll bring them in. George's story's shaky, and Clara's not helping herself." Miss Marple left the station, her stick tapping the path. The village was calm, but she felt a storm coming. Victor Lane was the key, she thought. He'd worked for Clara's first husband, maybe stole the brooch, maybe knew how Henry died. And now he was here, arguing with Clara and George. Had Robert found him? Was that why he was dead? She stopped by the village shop to buy sugar. Mr. Harris, the shopkeeper, was sweeping, his face grim. "Miss Marple, it's a bad business," he said. "That limping man I saw, I heard he was in Danamouth. People say he's trouble." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. Every bit helps." At home, she lit her fire and sat with her knitting, though her hands stayed still. The clues were piling up: the knitting needle, the blue spark note, the whistle, the photograph. Victor Lane. She thought of Clara's lie, George's red face, Emily's story. Victor had come to Willow House, and Robert had died. Was Victor the killer, or was he a pawn in someone else's game? The village clock struck 5, its chimes soft in the evening air. Miss Marple set her knitting down and walked to her desk. She wrote a note to herself, listing the clues. Victor Lane, she thought. He was the thread that tied Clara's past to Robert's death. But how? As she sealed the note, there was a knock at her door. It was Dolly Bantry, her face pale. "Jane, you won't believe it. Emily just told me she saw Clara with that limping man again, days before Robert died. In the garden, late at night." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Did she hear anything, Dolly?" She said Clara was whispering something about keeping a secret. The man sounded angry, like he wanted something. Miss Marple nodded, her mind like a needle threading clues. Victor Lane, Clara, a secret. The pattern was clearer now, but one piece was missing. She thought of the knitting needle, the blue spark note. Was Victor after the brooch, or something more? "Thank you, Dolly," she said. "I think I'll visit Willow House tomorrow. There's more to learn." As Dolly left, Miss Marple sat back, her mind busy. The photograph, Victor Lane, the arguments, they all pointed to Clara's past. She'd find the truth, she thought, and soon. The threads were tight, ready to be pulled. Chapter 6. The Hidden Detail. The morning sun crept through the curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting soft light on her knitting, which lay untouched on the table. Her mind was too busy for needles and yarn, stitching together the clues of Robert Ashford's murder, the knitting needle in the library, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, the photograph of Clara with Victor Lane, and now the limping man seen by both Emily and Mr. Tatees were threads in a tangled pattern, and Miss Marple was close to seeing the whole picture. Victor Lane, the jeweller's apprentice from Clara's past, was a big clue, but something smaller, something overlooked, nagged at her. She thought of the knitting needle in the library, its silver tip gleaming by the desk. Clara had claimed it was hers, but swore she hadn't brought it downstairs. Miss Marple knew people lied about small things to hide bigger ones, like Mrs. Hodges, who'd lied about a stolen ring to cover her debts. The needle felt important, a detail that didn't fit. She decided to visit Willow House again, to look. At the library, with fresh eyes, Miss Marple put on her coat and hat, grabbed her stick, and walked through St. Mary Mead. The village was quiet, but whispers about Mr. Tate's return and the limping man filled the air. At Willow House, the maid let her in, her face pale. Inspector Craddock was already there, standing in the library, his notebook open. The room was as it had been, bookshelves tall, rug crooked, window shut now. but the knitting needle still lay by the desk untouched. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, nodding. "Back for another look." She smiled, her eyes sharp. "An old lady's curiosity, Inspector. That needle bothers me. May I see it?" Craddock shrugged and picked it up, careful to use a cloth. He handed it to Miss Marple, who held it to the light. The needle was thin, its tip sharper than most, almost like a tiny blade. She turned it slowly, her heart jumping as she spotted something, a tiny blue thread caught in the needle's eye, barely visible. It shimmered like silk and matched the deep blue of a sapphire. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "look." At this, a thread caught in the needle. Craddock leaned closer, squinting. "Well, I'll be. It's small, but it's there. Could be nothing, though." Miss Marple's lips curved. "Or everything." "May I keep looking?" Craddock nodded, and she moved around the library, her stick tapping. The rug was still crooked, as if someone had tripped in a hurry. The desk was neat, except for the hidden drawer where the photograph had been found. She thought of Robert's body, the blue spark note in his pocket. The sapphire brooch, she knew, was at the heart of this. But how did the needle fit? She remembered a village seamstress, Mrs. Finch, who used needles like this for fine work. Miss Marple had seen her at the church fair, showing off a sharp-tipped needle for delicate stitches. Could it be a weapon? She thought of old Mr. Jenkins, stabbed with a skewer in a fight. Small things could kill if used right. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, handing back the needle. "I think I'll visit Mrs. Finch. She might know about this needle." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think it's the murder weapon?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think it's curious. That's all." She left Willow House and walked to Mrs. Finch's cottage, a small place with roses climbing the walls. Mrs. Finch was sewing by her window, her hands quick. "Miss Marple," she said, smiling. "What brings you here?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her stick by her side. "I'm curious about knitting needles, Mrs. Finch. The sharp ones, like you use for fine work." Mrs. Finch nodded, pulling out a needle that matched the one from the library. "These are special," she said. "Thin, sharp, good for lace or silk. But you've got to be careful, they're like little daggers." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. "Did you ever lend one to Mrs. Ashford?" Mrs. Finch thought for a moment. "Yes, a few weeks ago. She said she had a special project, something delicate. Borrowed 2 needles, but only brought one back." Miss Marple's mind clicked like knitting needles. Clara had a sharp needle, and one was missing. She thought of the blue thread. The blue spark note was the thread from the brooch, or something else. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," she said, standing. "You've been very helpful." As she walked back to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Victor Lane. Craddock had said he was spotted in Danamouth, and Emily had seen him arguing with Clara. Mr. Tate had seen him with George. The limping man was everywhere, it seemed, and always tied to the Ashfords. She thought of the photograph, Clara and Victor, years ago. What was their secret? At the police station, Craddock was waiting, his face grim. "Miss Marple, we've got news. Victor Lane was seen in Danamouth last night at a pub called the Red Lion. He's staying there under a false name." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "And the Ashfords? Have you spoken to them about him?" "Clara denies knowing him," Craddock said. "But George admitted to meeting a man in the garden a week ago. Said it was about business, nothing to do with Robert." Miss Marple's lips tightened. George's story was shaky, like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied about a theft. What kind of business, Inspector? Craddock shrugged. He wouldn't say. Just got red in the face and clammed up. Miss Marple thought of the whistle, the argument Mr. Tate overheard. Money and a promise, he'd said. Was Victor after the brooch, or something more? She remembered young Tommy Brown, who'd argued with a stranger over money and ended up in trouble. Promises could be dangerous. She thanked Craddock and walked home, her stick tapping the path. The village was calm, but she felt a storm brewing. The knitting needle, with its blue thread, was a clue she couldn't ignore. It tied Clara to the murder, but how? And why was Victor Lane here, stirring up trouble? At her cottage, Miss Marple lit her fire and sat with her knitting, though her hands stayed still. She thought of the clues, the needle, the thread, the blue spark note, the whistle, the photograph. Victor Lane, they all pointed to Clara's past, to the sapphire brooch, to Robert's death. She remembered Emily's story, Clara arguing with Victor, saying he was owed something. Was it money or silence? The village clock struck 4, its chime soft in the afternoon air. Miss Marple set her knitting down and walked to her desk. She wrote a note to herself, listing the clues. The blue thread was the hidden detail, she thought. It was small, easy to miss, but it could unravel everything. There was a knock at her door. It was Dolly Bantry, her face pale. "Jane, you won't believe it. Mrs. Price at the post office says Clara got a package last week from a jeweller in London. It was small, like it could hold a brooch." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Did she'll say anything else, Dolly? Just that Clara looked nervous when she picked it up. Kept it hidden under her coat. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A package from a jeweller. The blue thread, the blue spark note. The brooch was close, she thought, and so was the truth. She remembered Mrs. Lane, who'd hidden a stolen brooch in a package. Clara was doing the same, she was sure. "Thank you, Dolly," she said. "I think I'll visit Willow House tomorrow. There's more to see." As Dolly left, Miss Marple sat back, her mind like a needle threading clues. The knitting needle, with its blue thread, was the key. It wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon, and the thread tied it to the brooch. She thought of Clara's lie, George's shaky hands, Victor's arguments. The pattern was almost complete, but one thread was still loose. She looked at her knitting, the yarn soft and blue, like the thread in the needle. It reminded her of the sapphire, the blue spark that had cost Robert his life. Tomorrow she'd pull that thread and see where it led. Chapter 7. The Sapphire's Secret. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, but her mind was far from the quiet beauty of St. Mary Mead. Robert Ashford's murder weighed heavy, its clues like threads. In a knotted scarf, the knitting needle with its blue thread, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, the photograph of Clara with Victor Lane, and the limping man seen by Mr. Tate and Emily, the blue thread caught in the needles. I felt like the heart of the puzzle. Miss Marple knew small things could hide big truths, like Mrs. Hodges, who'd lied about a ring to cover her shame. She sipped her tea, thinking of the Ashfords. Clara's tight lips, George's shaky hands, Emily's nervous eyes, they all pointed to secrets. The sapphire brooch, tied to Clara's first husband's death, was the key, she was sure. And now, Dolly's news about Clara's package from a jeweller made her heart beat faster. Was the brooch back in Willow House? Had Robert died because he knew too much? Miss Marple decided to talk to Emily again. The girl had seen Clara with Victor Lane, and she knew about Robert's search for the brooch. Emily was young, easily scared, but honest, like young Sally Green, who'd told the truth about her brother's theft when pressed gently. Miss Marple put on her coat, grabbed her stick, and walked to Willow House. Her steps slow, but her mind quick. The village was buzzing with gossip about Mr. Tate's return and the limping man. Mrs. Price at the post office was telling everyone about Clara's package, her voice loud. Miss Marple listened but didn't speak. Gossip was useful, like loose stitches in a sweater, but she needed facts. At Willow House, the air felt heavy, like before a storm. The maid let her in, her face pale. Clara was in the parlour, reading, but her eyes were sharp. George was in the study, his pipe smoke curling out the door. Emily was in the garden, clipping roses, her hands unsteady. Miss Marple found her there, the scent of flowers sweet, but the mood grim. "Good morning, Emily," Miss Marple said, her voice kind. "You're hard at work. Roses are tricky, aren't they?" Emily looked up, her eyes red. "Oh, Miss Marple, I guess so. I just needed something to do." Miss Marple nodded, settling on a bench nearby. "It's hard, with Robert gone. You said he was looking into the brooch. Did he find anything?" Emily's hands froze on the clippers. She glanced at the house, her voice low. "He thought it was cursed. The sapphire, I mean. He said it caused his father's death, Thuncle Henry, Aunt Clara's first husband. Robert hired someone, a detective, to find Victor Lane. He thought Victor knew what happened." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. A detective, she thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd hired a man to find his stolen bike, and stirred up trouble. Did Robert say what Victor knew? Emily bit her lip. He said Victor was there when Uncle Henry died. Robert thought Aunt Clara and Victor, well, that they planned it. For the brooch, he found letters from Victor to Aunt Clara, hidden in the attic. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Letters, like the blue spark note, they could be clues. Where are those letters now, dear? Emily shook her head. Robert had them. He was going to show them to the police, but then her voice broke. Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been brave, Emily. Did Robert mention anything else about the brooch or Victor?" Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "He said the brooch wasn't lost. He thought Aunt Clara had it, hidden somewhere. He saw her with a package from a jeweller a few days ago." Miss Marple's mind clicked like knitting needles. The package Mrs. Price had mentioned, the blue thread in the needle. The brooch was close, she thought. "Thank you, Emily. You've helped more than you know." She left the garden, her thoughts racing. Clara had the brooch, or knew where it was. Robert had been too close to the truth, and it had cost him his life. Miss Marple thought of the knitting needle, its sharp tip and blue thread. Was it the weapon, and was the thread from the brooch's pouch? She stopped by the village post office to confirm Mrs. Price's story. The postmistress was sweeping, her eyes bright with news. "Miss Marple, you heard about Clara's package. Came from a fancy jeweller in London, small but heavy. She snatched it up, didn't let anyone see." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "When was this, Mrs. Price?" "Last Tuesday," she said. 3 days before Robert was killed." Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, her stick tapping. Tuesday, Robert had been angry at the tea party, talking about the brooch. Had he seen the package? She thought of Mr. Grayson, who'd died over a gold watch his brother wanted. Jewels made people greedy, and greed made them dangerous. She decided to visit Inspector Craddock at the police station. The village was quiet, but eyes watched from behind curtains. At the station, Craddock was sorting papers, his face tired. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're back. Got another clue?" She smiled, her eyes sharp. "Just a thought, Inspector. Emily says Robert hired a detective to find Victor Lane, and Mrs. Price saw Clara get a package from a jeweler. Days before the murder." Craddock's eyebrows shot up. "A package and a detective. That's news. I'll check with the London jewelers. And we're still looking for Lane. He's slippery, that one." Miss Marple nodded, her mind busy. "What about George? Did he say more about meeting Victor?" Craddock sighed. "He admitted to seeing a man in the garden, like Mr. Tate said. Claimed it was about buying back the brooch. Said he didn't know the man was Victor Lane." Miss Marple's lips tightened. George's story was shaky, like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied about a theft. Buying back the brooch. Did he say where it was? "No," Craddock said. "Just got red in the face and mumbled about family business." Miss Marple thought of the blue thread, the package, the blue spark note. George was hiding something, maybe to protect Clara. She remembered young Sally Green, who'd lied for her. Brother, out of loyalty. Loyalty could blind people to the truth. "Thank you, Inspector," she said. "I think I'll speak to Clara again. She might know more about that package." She walked to Willow House, her stick tapping the path. The air was crisp, but she felt a storm coming. At the house, Clara was in the parlour, her hands busy with needlework. Miss Marple knocked and was let in, her eyes on Clara's face. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "I heard about a package you got last week. From a jeweller, was it?" Clara's needle paused, her face pale. "A package? Oh, just some trinket. Nothing important." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara's voice was too quick, like Mrs. Hodges when she'd lied about a ring. "Curious," Miss Marple said softly. "Robert was so interested in your brooch. Did the package have anything to do with it?" Clara's eyes flashed. "The brooch is gone, Miss Marple. I've told you that." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clara was lying, she was sure. She thought of the knitting needle, the blue thread. Was the thread from the brooch's pouch brought out when Clara opened the package? She left the parlour and found George in the study, his pipe cold. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you mentioned buying back the brooch from Victor Lane, was it?" George's face went red. I didn't know his name. Just a man offering to sell it back. I thought it would calm Robert down." Miss Marple's lips curved. George's red face was like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied. "And did you get it back?" George looked away. "No, he wanted too much money." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts spinning. George's story didn't add up, and Clara's package was too convenient. She thanked him and walked home, her stick tapping. The village was calm, but she felt the puzzled tightening dot at her cottage. She lit her fire and sat with her knitting, though her hands stayed still. The clues were clear. The knitting needle, the blue thread, the blue spark note, the package. Victor Lane, Robert had been close to proving Clara's secret, and someone had stopped him. She thought of the photograph, Clara and Victor together. Was Victor the killer? Or was he working with Clara? The village clock struck 6, its chimes soft in the evening air. Miss Marple set her knitting down and walked to her desk. She wrote a note to Craddock, suggesting he search Willow House for The brooch. Then she paused, her pen hovering. The blue thread was the key, she thought. It was small, but it could unravel everything. There was a knock at her door. It was Emily, her face white. "Miss Marple, I had to come. I saw Aunt Clara in the attic, looking through old boxes. She was holding something small, wrapped in blue cloth." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Did you see what it was, dear?" Emily shook her head. "No, but she looked scared. And then she fainted when I asked about the brooch." Miss Marple's heart jumped. Clara fainting with a blue cloth. The thread, the package, the brooch, it was all connected. "Thank you, Emily," she said. "I think it's time to gather everyone at Willow House. Tomorrow we'll sort this out." As Emily left, Miss Marple sat back, her mind like a needle threading clues. The sapphire's secret was close, she thought. Clara's lie, George's story, Victor's shadow, they all pointed to the brooch. Tomorrow she'd pull the final thread and see the truth. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead. But Miss Jane Marple's mind was bright with purpose. Robert Ashford's murder was a puzzle nearing its end, with clues like threads in a tight knot. The knitting needle with its blue thread, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, the photograph of Clara with Victor Lane, and Emily's tale of Clara's package and fainting spell. The sapphire brooch, tied to Clara's past, was the heart of it all. And Miss Marple was ready to pull the final threads to reveal the truth. She decided to set a trap, something she'd done before, like with Mrs. Hodges, who'd confessed to stealing when cornered gently. A tea party at Willow House would bring everyone together: Clara, George, Emily, and Inspector Craddock. Miss Marple would watch their faces, drop a few hints, and see who flinched. The blue thread, she thought, was the key. It linked the knitting needle to the brooch, and someone in that house knew how. Miss Marple sent notes to the Ashfords and Craddock, inviting them to Willow House at 4 o'clock. She asked Dolly Bantry to help, knowing her friend's knack for making people talk. By noon, she was at the manor, helping Dolly arrange teacups and scones. The air was crisp, but Miss Marple felt a storm brewing. "Jane," Dolly said, setting out a plate, "you've got that look. You're up to something, aren't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Just a little gathering, Dolly. People say things when they're nervous." Dolly grinned. "You're sly, Jane. I'll bet you know who killed Robert." Miss Marple smiled, but said nothing. She thought of the clues, the needle, the thread, the package. Victor Lane, Clara's lie about the brooch, and George's shaky story about meeting Victor were loose stitches ready to unravel. She needed them to talk, to slip. At 4, Willow House was ready. The parlour was warm, with a fire crackling and teacups gleaming. Clara sat stiffly, her hands clasped. George stood by the window, his pipe unlit, his face red. Emily perched on a chair, her eyes darting. Craddock sat with his notebook, watching everyone. Dolly poured tea, her chatter filling the quiet. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but her eyes sharp. "It's a sad time, with Robert gone. But I've been thinking about that brooch, the sapphire one. It seems important, doesn't it?" Clara's cup rattled in its saucer. "The brooch, it's long gone, Miss Marple." "I've said that." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "Yes, but Robert thought otherwise. He was asking questions, wasn't he, about your first husband, Mrs. Ashford, and Victor Lane." George coughed, his pipe dropping to the floor. Emily's eyes widened, but she stayed silent. Craddock leaned forward, his pencil ready. "Victor Lane," Clara said, her voice sharp. "I don't know him." Miss Marple's lips curved. "That's odd. There's a photograph, you see, of you and Victor from years ago. And Emily saw you with a limping man just last week." Clara's face went pale, but she shook her head. "You're mistaken. I've never met him." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Then there's the package from a jeweller in London. Mrs. Price saw you collect it, Mrs. Ashford. Was it the brooch?" Clara's hand shook. "A trinket, that's all. Nothing to do with this." George stepped forward, his voice loud. "Leave her alone, Miss Marple. The brooch is gone. I tried to buy it back, but the deal fell through." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. George's red face was like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied about a theft. She thought of young Sally Green, who'd cracked under gentle pressure. "Curious," she said softly. "Mr. Tate saw you with a limping man," to George, "arguing about money and a promise." George's mouth opened, then shut. Emily gasped, her hand on her lips. Craddock scribbled fast. His eyes on George. Miss Marple reached into her bag and pulled out a handkerchief, letting the knitting needle from the library slip to the floor. It landed with a soft clink, its blue thread catching the light. "This needle," she said, "was found by Robert's body. Mrs. Ashford, you said it's yours. But why was it in the library?" Clara's eyes locked on the needle, her face white. I told you, I didn't bring it there." Emily stared at the needle, her voice small. "That thread. It's like the cloth I saw Aunt Clara with. In the attic, deep blue, like the brooch's pouch." Clara's cup fell, shattering on the floor. Tea splashed her dress, but she didn't move. George stepped toward her, then stopped, his hands shaky. Craddock stood, his voice firm. "Mrs. Ashford, what's this about a blue cloth?" "It's nothing," Clara snapped. "An old shawl. That's all." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. Clara's lie was crumbling, like Mrs. Hodges when she'd confessed to stealing. The blue thread was the hidden detail, tying the needle to the brooch, and Clara to the murder. Dolly broke the silence, her voice bright. "More tea? Anyone? This is getting quite exciting." Miss Marple smiled, watching Clara's hands twist. "The brooch has a story, doesn't it?" she said. "Robert thought it was cursed. He was digging into your past, Mrs. Ashford. Did he find something you didn't want known?" Clara stood, her voice shaking. "This is nonsense. I won't sit here and be accused." Craddock held up a hand. "No one's accusing, Mrs. Ashford, but we need answers. Victor Lane's in Dannemouth, and we're bringing him in. If he knows it's best to tell us now." Clara sat down hard, her face like stone. George looked away, his pipe forgotten. Emily's eyes were wide, fixed on the needle. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind like a needle threading clues. The trap was working. Clara was nervous. George was hiding something, and Emily knew more than she said. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, "you might check the attic, where Emily saw Clara with that blue cloth. It could be important." Craddock nodded, scribbling. "I'll send Tom up there now." Clara's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple thought of the blue spark note, the package, the photograph. The brooch was close, she was sure, and Clara was scared. She remembered Mr. Grayson, who died over a gold watch his brother coveted. Greed made people desperate. The tea party went on, with Dolly chattering to ease the tension. But the air was thick, like before a storm. Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching Clara's hands, George's red face, Emily's nervous glances. The blue thread was the key, she thought. It wasn't just a thread, it was proof. As the clock struck 5, the maid rushed in, her face pale. "Inspector, there's a man at the gate. Tall, with a limp, says he needs to see Mrs. Ashford." Clara gasped, her hand on her heart. George dropped his pipe again, his face white. Emily stood, her eyes wide. Craddock jumped up, his notebook forgotten. "Bring him in," he said. Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. Victor Lane, here at Willow House. She thought of the whistle, the arguments, the blue thread. The trap had worked, but the puzzle wasn't complete. Victor's story would pull the final threads, she was sure. "Mrs. Ashford," she said softly, "if Victor has something to say, it's best to listen. Secrets don't stay hidden." Clara's eyes met hers, full of fear. Miss Marple smiled, her mind sharp. The knitting needle, the blue thread, the brooch, they were all connected, and Victor Lane was the link. She thought of Mrs. Lane, who'd confessed when cornered. Clara was close to breaking, she could feel it. Craddock stepped to the door, ready to meet Victor. Dolly whispered, "Jane, you're amazing. You've got them all rattled." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's just a matter of watching, Dolly. People show what they hide, if you look closely." The fire crackled, the teacups sat untouched, and the parlour was silent except for Clara's quick breaths. Miss Marple sat back, her hands folded, her mind like a needle threading clues. Victor Lane was here, and the truth was close. Tomorrow, she thought, the puzzle would be solved. Chapter 9. Victor's confession. The parlour at Willow House was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her hands folded, her eyes sharp as needles. The tea party she'd planned had worked. Clara was nervous. George was red-faced, and Emily's gasp at the blue thread had shaken them all. The knitting needle, with its tiny blue thread, lay on the table, a silent clue pointing to the sapphire. Brooch and Robert Ashford's murder. Now, with Victor Lane at the gate, the puzzle was close to solved. Miss Marple knew the truth was near, like a loose stitch ready to unravel. Inspector Craddock stood by the door, his face stern. "Bring him in," he told the maid, who scurried out, her footsteps quick. Clara sat stiffly, her hands clenched, her eyes darting to the knitting needle. George stared at the floor, his pipe forgotten. Emily clutched her teacup, her face pale. Dolly Bantry hovered by the tea tray, her eyes wide with excitement. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind threading clues. The knitting needle, the blue thread, the blue spark note, the strange whistle, the photograph of Clara with Victor Lane, and the package from the jeweller. The brooch was the heart of it, she was sure, tied to Clara's past and Robert's death. She thought of Mrs. Hodges, who'd confessed to stealing when cornered. Clara was close to breaking, and Victor's arrival would pull the final thread. The door opened, and Victor Lane stepped in. He was tall and thin, with a sharp face and a limp that made his steps uneven. His dark coat was dusty, his eyes cold, but nervous. He looked at Clara, then away, his hands twitching. "Mr. Lane," Craddock said, his voice firm. "You wanted to see Mrs. Ashford. Why?" Victor's eyes flicked to Clara, who sat frozen. I've got something to say," he said, his voice low, "about the brooch and Robert." Clara's cup rattled, but she didn't speak. George coughed, his face redder than ever. Emily's eyes widened, but she stayed silent. Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart steady but her mind racing. "Go on," Craddock said, his notebook ready. Victor took a deep breath. "I worked for Henry Langston, Clara's first husband, years ago. He was a jeweler, had a sapphire brooch worth a fortune. I stole it after he died. Clara knew." Clara gasped, her hand on her heart. "That's a lie," she snapped. "I never knew you took it." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Don't play innocent, Clara. You told me to take it. Said Henry was going to sell it, and you'd lose everything. You gave him something poison, wasn't it? To make him fall." The room went still, like the air before thunder. Clara's face was white, her hands shaking. George stepped forward, his voice loud. "That's enough. You can't talk to my wife like that." Craddock held up a hand. "Let him finish, Mr. Ashford." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Victor's words were like stitches falling into place. She thought of young Tommy Brown, who'd confessed to stealing when pressed. Victor was scared, and scared people told the truth. Victor went on, his voice shaky. "I kept the brooch, hid it for years, but Robert found me. He hired a detective, tracked me to London. He wanted the brooch back, said he'd tell the police about Henry's death. I came to St. Mary Mead to talk to Clara." Clara stood, her voice sharp. "I never saw you. You're making this up." Victor shook his head. "You saw me, Clara, in the garden a week ago. You paid me to keep quiet, gave me money from that package you got. But Robert wouldn't stop. He came to my room in Danimouth, said he had proof letters between you and me about Henry." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. The letters Emily had mentioned, hidden in the attic. She thought of the blue spark note, the blue thread. "What happened then, Mr. Lane?" she asked, her voice soft. Victor looked at her, his eyes haunted. "I told Clara he was getting close. She said she'd handle it. That night I came to Willow House to talk to her again. I heard a scream. Millicent ran. I didn't know Robert was dead till later." Craddock's pencil scratched fast. "You're saying Mrs. Ashford knew Robert was a threat?" Victor nodded. "She was scared. Said she'd do anything to keep her secret." Clara's voice broke. "Lies, all lies." "I never spoke to you, Victor." Miss Marple's lips curved. Clara's fear was like Mrs. Lane's when she'd been caught with a stolen brooch. She looked at the knitting needle, its blue thread glinting. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "that needle was found by Robert's body, with a blue thread, like the pouch for your brooch. Emily saw you with a blue cloth in the attic." Clara's eyes locked on the needle, her face like chalk. I told you, it's an old shawl." Emily's voice was small. "It wasn't a shawl, Aunt Clara. I saw it wrapped around something small, like a brooch." Clara's hands shook, and she sank into her chair. George stepped toward her, then stopped, his face pale. Craddock looked at Miss Marple, his eyes narrow. "Miss Marple, you think the needle's the weapon?" She nodded, her voice gentle. "It's sharp enough, Inspector. And the thread blue, like a sapphire's pouch ties it to the brooch. Robert was stabbed, and the needle was there, out of place." Craddock picked up the needle, turning it. "In the light, it's possible. We'll test it for blood." Miss Marple's mind raced. The needle, the thread, Victor's story, they all pointed to Clara. She thought of the whistle, heard before Emily's scream. A signal, perhaps, for Victor to leave. She remembered Mr. Tate's words, Victor arguing with George about money and a promise. Was George part of it? Mr. Lane, she said, you met George, too, didn't you? In the garden, before the murder. Victor's eyes flicked to George, who froze. Yeah. He wanted the brooch, said he'd pay, but I told him to talk to Clara. She had it. George's voice was hoarse. I was trying to fix things. For Clara, for Robert. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. George's red face was like Mr. Potter's when he'd lied about a theft. Fix things, Mr. Ashford, or cover them up. Craddock turned to George. You didn't tell me about Victor. Why? George's hands shook. I didn't think it mattered. I just wanted the brooch back. The room was silent, except for Clara's quick breaths. Miss Marple watched her, her mind like a needle threading clues. Clara had poisoned Henry, hidden the brooch, and paid Victor to stay quiet. Robert had found out, and Clara had used the knitting needle to stop him. The blue thread from the brooch's pouch was the hidden detail that proved it. Inspector, Miss Marple said, you might search the attic, where Emily saw Clara with the blue cloth. The pouch, and maybe the brooch, could be there. Craddock nodded, his face grim. Tom, get up there now. Clara stood, her voice a scream. You can't, it's my house. Craddock's voice was calm. We have a warrant, Mrs. Ashford. Sit down. Clara sank back, her face white. Emily's eyes were wide, her hands trembling. Dolly whispered, Jane, you're brilliant. You've got her cornered. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. It's just watching, Dolly. People show their secrets, if you look. The maid returned, her face pale. Inspector, there's a crowd outside. Village folk saying they saw Victor sneaking around. Craddock sighed. Keep them back. We've got enough to handle. Miss Marple thought of the whistle, the blue spark note, the letters. Clara's secret was out, and Victor's confession had cracked the case. But Clara wasn't done, she thought. People like her fought to the end, like Mrs. Hodges when she'd run from the truth. As Craddock gave orders, Clara stood again, her eyes wild. She grabbed her coat and ran for the door, her footsteps quick. George shouted, Clara, wait. But she was gone, out into the night. Craddock cursed and ran after her, calling for Tom. Emily cried, her hands over her face. Victor stood still, his limp obvious as he shifted. Miss Marple sat back, her heart steady. Clara's flight was proof, she thought. Like Mrs. Lane, who'd run when her theft was found out. Dolly, she said, fetch me another cup of tea. Will you? I think the inspector will catch her. Dolly grinned, her eyes bright. Jane, you're a wonder. You knew she'd run, didn't you? Miss Marple smiled, her mind clear. The blue thread had unravelled Clara's lies, and Victor's words had sealed it. She thought of the knitting needle, the brooch, the murder. The puzzle was almost complete, but Clara's run meant one last chase. Outside, the village was alive. With shouts, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the door. Craddock would find Clara, she was sure. The truth was out, and St. Mary Mead would soon be quiet again. Chapter 10. The case closed. The night air in St. Mary Mead was sharp, filled with the sound of running feet and shouting voices. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour of Willow House, her hands folded, her eyes calm but bright. Clara Ashford had fled moments ago, her coat flapping as she ran into the dark after Victor Lane's confession had shattered her lies. Inspector Craddock and Constable Tom were chasing her, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies. The knitting needle with its blue thread still lay on the table, a tiny clue that had unravelled a murder. Miss Marple sipped her tea, knowing the truth was out and justice was near. The room was quiet now, except for Emily's soft sobs and George's heavy breathing. Victor Lane stood by the door, his limp clear as he shifted nervously. Dolly Bantry poured more tea, her hands shaky but her voice bright. "Jane, you've done it again," she whispered. "Clara's run, and that proves it, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's lips curved. "Running often means guilt, Dolly. Like Mrs. Hodges, when she stole from the church fund and tried to hide." Emily looked up, her eyes red. "Aunt Clara. Did she really kill Robert?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "Let's wait for the inspector, dear. The truth will be clear soon." She thought of the clues. The knitting needle, its blue thread matching the brooch's pouch, the blue spark. Note, the strange whistle, the photograph of Clara with Victor Lane, and the package from the jeweller. Victor's confession had tied them together. Clara had poisoned her first husband, Henry, for the sapphire brooch with Victor's help. Robert had found out, and Clara had stabbed him with the needle to keep him quiet. The blue thread caught. In the needle's eye was the hidden detail that cracked the case. George cleared his throat, his face pale. "I didn't know," he muttered. I thought I was helping Clara, meeting that man Victor, to get the brooch back." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. George's red face reminded her of Mr. Potter, who'd lied to protect her friend and ended up in trouble. "You met Victor, Mr. Ashford," she said softly. "What did he want?" George's hands shook. "Money. He said he'd sell the brooch, but only if Clara paid him to stay quiet about Henry's death. I told her, and she said she'd handle it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind clear. George hadn't killed Robert, but he'd hidden the truth. Like young Sally Green, who'd lied for her brother. Loyalty could be as dangerous as greed. The door burst open, and Craddock stepped in, his face grim but triumphant. Constable Tom was behind him, holding Clara's arm. Her coat was torn, her hair wild, her eyes full of fear. "Found her by the river," Craddock said. "Tried to run to Dannymoth, but Tom was faster." Clara struggled, her voice sharp. "Let me go. I've done nothing." Craddock's voice was calm. "Mrs. Ashford, we found the brooch in the attic, wrapped in a blue pouch, just like Emily said. And the needles being tested, it's got traces of blood." Clara's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. Emily gasped, her eyes wide. Victor looked away, his limp more pronounced as he leaned against the wall. Miss Marple watched, her heart steady. The puzzle was complete, the threads all tied. Mrs. Ashford Craddock said, "Victor Lane says you paid him to keep quiet about Henry Langston's death, and Robert was asking questions. Did you kill him?" Clara's hands dropped, her eyes hard. "You can't prove anything," she hissed. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, like a grandmother's. "The needle, Mrs. Ashford, it was yours, sharp enough to kill. And the blue thread, it came from the brooch's pouch, didn't it? You opened it, maybe to check the sapphire, and the thread caught. Robert was close to the truth, so you stopped him." Clara's eyes met Miss Marple's, and something broke. Her shoulders sagged, her voice a whisper. He wouldn't stop. He found the letters, Victor's letters about Henry. He was going to the police. I had to protect myself. The room was silent, except for Emily's sob. George stared at Clara, his face white. Victor's head hung low, his hands in his pockets. Craddock nodded, his pencil still. "That's a confession, Mrs. Ashford. You're under arrest for Robert Ashford's murder." Tom stepped forward, his face serious, and led Clara out. She didn't fight, her steps slow, her head down. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Lane, who'd confessed to a theft and walked away quietly. Guilt, once spoken, was heavy. Craddock turned to Victor. "And you, Lane, you're coming too, aiding a crime, theft, maybe more." Victor nodded, his voice dull. "I didn't kill anyone, but I'll tell you everything." As Tom took Victor out, Emily stood, her voice shaky. "Miss Marple, is it over?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. "It's over, dear. The truth is out, and that's enough." George sat heavily, his hands over his face. "I should have stopped her. I knew she was scared, but I didn't think." Miss Marple patted his shoulder. "You couldn't know, Mr. Ashford. People hide their hearts, even from those they love." Dolly poured more tea, her voice soft. "Jane, you're a wonder. That tiny thread, how did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Small things, Dolly. They're always there, if you look. Like a stitch out of place in a sweater." Craddock closed his notebook, his face tired but relieved. "Miss Marple, you've done it again. The needle, the thread, Victor's storiette, all fits. We'll search the house for those letters Robert found. They'll seal the case." Miss Marple nodded, her mind clear. The letters, the brooch, the needle, they were proof of Clara's guilt, and Victor's confession had tied them together. She thought of the blue spark note, Robert's last clue. He'd been so close to the truth, and it had cost him his life. "Inspector," she said, "what will happen to the brooch?" Craddock shrugged. "It's evidence now. After the trial, it'll go to Emily, I expect. She's the next of kin." Emily's eyes widened. "Me, but I don't want it. It's cursed." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "It's just a jewel, dear. The curse is in people's hearts, not the stone." Emily nodded, her face still pale. "I'll sell it, maybe. Use the money to fix Willow House. Make it a home again." Miss Marple smiled, her heart warm. Emily was young, but strong, like young Sally Green, who'd rebuilt her life after her brother's trouble. Willow House would heal, and so would St. Mary Mead. As the clock struck 7, the parlour emptied. Craddock left to file his report. Promising to update Miss Marple, George went to his study, his steps heavy. Emily walked to the garden, her eyes on the roses. Dolly stayed, helping Miss Marple gather the teacups. "Jane," Dolly said, "you're like a magician. That needle, that thread, nobody else saw it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's just watching, Dolly. People leave clues, like crumbs on a table." They walked back to Miss Marple's cottage, the village quiet under the stars. The shouts were gone, the lanterns dark. St. Mary Mead was peaceful again, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple lit her fire and sat with her knitting, her hands moving now, the yarn soft and blue. She thought of Clara, alone in a cell, her lies undone. Of Victor, telling his story to save himself. Of Robert, who'd died for the truth. And of the blue thread, so small but so strong. It reminded her of Mr. Grayson's case, where a single button had solved a murder. Small things, she knew, could change everything. The village clock struck 8, its chimes soft in the night. Miss Marple set her knitting down, her mind at rest. The case was closed, the puzzle solved. But St. Mary Mead was never truly quiet, she thought. Secrets always lurked, like shadows in a garden. She looked at her yarn, blue like the sapphire, and smiled. The brooch was found, the killer caught, and Emily would start anew. That was enough. She thought of her roses, waiting for her care, and her garden, full of life. Tomorrow she'd tend them, watching the village as she always did. As she climbed the stairs to bed, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the rail. The blue thread, she thought, was a lesson. The smallest detail could crack a case wide open if you knew where to look. She smiled, her eyes bright, and turned out the light dot. St. Mary Mead slept, its peace restored. But Miss Marple knew the truth. A village was never just a village. It was a web of hearts and secrets, and she was its quiet weaver.